It's not a real sports car. That's what one road tester wrote about the Fiat X1 the year it launched. He was staring at the engine size, missing everything else. Bertone hadn't built a joke. He'd designed the layout that mattered. This tiny Italian coupe used a motor borrowed from Fiat's family hatchback, mounted in the one place that changed everything, behind the driver's seat. Before we get into it, guess this. Why would Fiat put a cheap little engine in a car built like a race machine? Drop your theory below. Fiat itself doubted this car long before anyone else did. Turin in the late 1960s ran on one industry above all others, and that industry was Fiat. Every supplier, every designer, every young engineer with ambition eventually ended up working for the company or working for someone who fed off its contracts. Inside that world, a small independent studio called Bertone had carved out a strange kind of freedom, building shapes for clients too bold for Fiat's own drawing boards. Marcello Gandini worked there. He'd already sketched the Lamborghini Countach and the Lancia Stratos by the time Fiat handed him a brief that sounded almost absurd on paper. Build something exotic, but keep it cheap enough for a schoolteacher to buy. Most designers would have softened the shape to match the budget. Gandini didn't. He drew a wedge. Low nose, flat hood, a roofline that dropped straight into the rear deck without a single soft curve to apologize for it. Sit inside an early prototype and the cabin felt tighter than logic allowed, wrapped around a driver rather than built to accommodate one. Nothing about the shape suggested a car priced for ordinary buyers. The layout underneath mattered more than the skin. Fiat's engineers mounted the engine behind the seats instead of up front, a decision usually reserved for cars wearing badges like Ferrari or Lamborghini. Weight sat almost evenly between the front and rear axles, close enough to 50-50 that testers struggled to describe the balance without reaching for words normally used on racing cars. Why give a budget coupe an architecture nobody expected it to have? Part of the answer sat in Washington, not Turin. American safety regulators were tightening rollover standards through the late 1960s, and rumors circulated that traditional convertibles might not survive the coming decade at all. Fiat wanted a Targa-roofed car ready for that shift, something open to the sky without the structural weakness a full convertible carried. That single requirement reshaped everything else. A mid-mounted engine freed up space for a proper Targa roof panel, one that could lift out and stow flat in the front trunk without crowding the cabin. Pop-up headlights kept the nose low without sacrificing visibility at night. 3 decisions, stacked on top of each other, turned a compliance problem into a genuine design statement. Not everyone inside Fiat saw it that way. Engineers who'd spent careers refining front-engine economy cars questioned why a company selling to budget-conscious families needed architecture this complicated. Mid-engine layouts demanded different cooling routes, different weight calculations, different assembly procedures than anything rolling down Fiat's main production lines. Complexity cost money, and money was the one thing this project wasn't supposed to spend freely. Accountants pushed back hardest. Internal estimates reportedly put the X19's production cost well above what a car at its intended price point should have carried, a gap someone inside the company would eventually have to justify. Reviewers who drove early press cars sensed none of that tension. One wrote that the handling felt like it belonged to something twice the price, unaware he'd stumbled onto the exact number worrying Fiat's own finance department. This wasn't a modest facelift dressed up with a new badge. It was Fiat betting real money on an architecture built for cars wearing far more expensive names than pricing the result low enough that the bet barely made sense on a spreadsheet. Gandini had drawn something Ferrari might have been proud to sell. Fiat intended to sell it for the price of a family hatchback. Production began in 1972, and the car reached showrooms carrying almost none of the compromise that usually comes with a budget sports coupe. Buyers who understood cars recognized immediately what they were looking at. What none of them could see yet was how little enthusiasm existed inside Fiat's own boardroom for keeping that ambition alive once the bills started arriving. None of them could see how little enthusiasm existed inside Fiat's own boardroom for keeping that ambition alive once the bills started arriving. Sales looked healthy enough on paper through the mid-1970s. Buyers across Europe and the United States kept ordering the car faster than certain plants could finish them, and export numbers climbed steadily year over year. Underneath those numbers, though, priorities inside Fiat were already shifting towards something the X19 had never been built to solve. Oil was the problem. The 1973 crisis had rattled every manufacturer in Europe, and Fiat's leadership responded the way most large companies respond to fear. They consolidated. Money that might have funded a proper engine upgrade for the X19 got redirected instead toward fuel-efficient family cars, the unglamorous sedans and hatchbacks that actually kept the company profitable through a decade of rising fuel prices. Imagine the small team still assigned to the X19 during this stretch, watching resources drain toward projects considered safer bets. Their car had launched with real ambition. It was aging now with almost none of the attention that ambition should have earned it. The engine grew slightly larger in 1978, a modest bump that felt more like maintenance than investment. Beyond that single change, the car largely stayed frozen while its rivals kept moving forward. Journalists noticed the neglect before most owners fully articulated it themselves. Road tests from the late 1970s increasingly framed the X19 as a car coasting on a decade-old idea, praised for handling that still felt sharp, criticized for an interior and equipment list that hadn't kept pace with anything else in its class. One reviewer called it a sports car, frozen in amber, elegant but untouched, as if Fiat had simply stopped remembering it existed. That's not far from what actually happened inside the company. Buried in almost every retrospective written about this car is one telling detail. Fiat spent more marketing dollars promoting its family sedans in a single year than it spent developing the X19 across its entire production run. A car built around genuine engineering ambition had become an afterthought, kept alive mostly because canceling it outright felt more disruptive than simply letting it drift. Owners felt something closer to quiet frustration than outrage. Plenty of them had bought the X19 specifically because it promised something rare at that price, and watching it stagnate while competitors added power, refinement, and features stung in a way that was hard to put into words. If you're the kind of person who wants more of these stories about ambition getting quietly starved from the inside, this is exactly the kind of history this channel keeps digging up, so consider hitting subscribe before we go further. By 1980, Fiat's leadership had reached a decision that said everything about how the company actually viewed the car. Rather than investing further, they offered full production rights to Bertone itself, the same studio that had designed the car in the first place. In 1982, the deal closed. Fiat stepped back almost entirely, and Bertone began building the car under its own name, the X19 badge, now carrying Bertone's identity instead of Fiat's. Think about what that decision actually represented. A company that had once bet real engineering resources on an exotic layout for a budget buyer had, within a decade, decided the project wasn't worth keeping inside its own walls. Bertone, a design house with nowhere near Fiat's manufacturing scale, was now solely responsible for a car built around cooling routes and assembly procedures Fiat's own accountants had once called too complicated to justify. Bertone didn't treat the handoff as an insult. Engineers there had believed in the car's architecture since Gandini first drew it, and taking full ownership meant finally controlling decisions that Fiat's committees had slowed for years. Production continued steadily through the early 1980s under Bertone's management, the car essentially unchanged in its core engineering but finally free from a parent company that had stopped caring what happened to it. What almost nobody outside Turin's design circles understood yet was how much that abandonment would end up mattering decades later. A car left alone by its own manufacturer was proving something about its own design that Fiat's spreadsheets had never bothered to measure. Decades later, that proof showed up in showrooms nobody at Fiat ever expected to influence. Look at Japan in the early 1980s. Toyota's engineers were sketching a small, affordable sports car meant to bring genuine driving excitement back to a mainstream lineup dominated by economy sedans. Internal design documents from that period describe engineers studying European mid-engine layouts for inspiration, the X19 chief among them. The result reached showrooms in 1984 wearing the name MR2. Its layout read like a direct answer to questions Bertone's small Turin team had already spent a decade solving. General Motors reached a similar conclusion around the same time. Pontiac's engineers, tasked with building something genuinely different from Detroit's usual front-engine formula, landed on a mid-mounted layout for their new Fiero, targeting exactly the affordable, driver-focused segment the X19 had quietly defined years earlier. Neither Toyota nor Pontiac credited Fiat publicly for the architecture. Both companies built cars that followed a blueprint Bertone's engineers had already proven could work at a reasonable price. Mid-engine layouts weren't new by themselves. They'd existed in racing and in exotic supercars for years before the X19 arrived. What hadn't existed, not really, was proof that ordinary buyers would accept that architecture in a car they could actually afford. Fiat had answered that question in 1972, whether the company itself valued the answer or not. Every affordable mid-engine coupe that followed owed something to a car its own maker had eventually stopped believing in. Consider the timeline. Fiat handed production over to Bertone in 1982, and Toyota's MR2 followed just 2 years later, with Pontiac's Fiero arriving that same year. The very moment Fiat gave up on the X19 almost exactly matched the moment two major manufacturers decided the formula was finally worth building themselves, at scale, for markets Fiat had never fully pursued outside Europe. Bertone kept building the car largely unchanged through most of the 1980s, its shape aging gracefully, while newer rivals borrowed its core idea and wrapped it in fresher styling. Sales slowed as the decade wore on, less because the architecture had failed and more because the car itself had simply gotten old, still riding on engineering first drawn a decade earlier. Production finally ended in 1989, closing out a run of roughly 160,000 cars built across 17 years. That number tells only part of the story. Decades later, the layout Gandini sketched and Fiat's engineers refused to properly fund became the standard formula for an entire category of affordable sports cars, one that eventually included Porsche's own Boxster in 1996. A company that could have built anything chose an architecture the X19 had already tested in the real world, against real buyers, for years before Porsche's own engineers seriously considered it. That contradiction says everything. Fiat's accountants once worried the X19 cost too much to build for what it was. Within 15 years, some of the most respected manufacturers in the industry had built entire product lines around proving that same architecture belonged in exactly that price range all along. Collectors understand this now in ways contemporary buyers never fully appreciated. Clean, unmodified X19s command real money today, specifically because enthusiasts recognize what the car actually represented, not a cheap wedge with a small engine, but the working prototype for an entire generation of sports cars that followed it. The mockery aimed at that engine badge back in 1972 had never understood what it was looking at. Fiat built the blueprint and then walked away from it. Everyone else spent the next 2 decades finishing what Turin had started. That road tester who called it not a real sports car never lived to see an MR2, a Fiero, or a Boxster borrow the very layout he'd dismissed. Fiat built the blueprint. Everyone else finished it. Would you have bet on this little wedge back in 1972? Tell me below, and follow for the next forgotten original.